Dear listeners, today we will be talking about society and environment, and I am Dr. Reema Bhatia from Miranda House, University of Delhi. When we talk about our society and our environment, what do we mean about it? When we talk about the environment, we refer to all that surrounds us. We are talking about all that influences us. We talk about how is it that the environment is something which acts as a stimulus for us, right? So, the environment in short consists of your physical environment, your biological environment and your social environment. The physical environment consists of our geographical and climatic environment. The physical environment actually means all that nature provides for man. So, that means it will include land, it will include water, it will include mountains, it will include the plains, it will include rivers. It will also be determined by where is it that you live. So, for example, if you live in an area in which there is a desert climate, so obviously there will be a low density of population meaning that the number of people living in that area is going to be low. As far as their means of livelihood is concerned, obviously it will not be something which is based on agriculture, since obviously growing crops in such a climate becomes very difficult. Similarly, if you are living in the mountain areas, again, even though the temperatures are not as high as you find in the deserts, but nevertheless the extremes of temperature are still to be found in the mountainous areas. So, again you will have a low density of population. The mountainous area could also be a desert climate, where again you will find a very low or a scanty rainfall, and again agriculture becomes a problem. So, again the density of population is going to be very low. As opposed to that, if you talk about plains, in the plains agriculture is possible, the extremes of climate are not so very much. So, you will find a very high density of population. Now, high density of population would also mean that as far as the lifestyles of the people are concerned, the kind of occupations that they are engaged in, the kind of livelihood that they are engaged in, all of that is going to be very different. And as we will see further along the presentation and the discussion, this will also have an impact on the level of development of that particular economy, the level of development of that particular society, which in turn will impact the environmental condition of that particular area, right. Now, when we talk about the biological environment, by the biological environment, you mean all that surrounds us in terms of biology. So, it would include the life that you find in the seas, it will include forests, it will include mountains, the oceans, it will include all the natural animals that you find in their natural habitat, plus also birds. So, in short, when you talk about the biological environment, you mean all plant forms, all life forms that surround us, right. Now, coming to the social environment will economic as well as cultural and social aspects. Now, when I am talking about the social environment, please also remember that the social environment is also interlinked with the other two forms of environment that we have discussed, that is the physical as well as environment, but we will come to that in a little while. Now, when you talk about the economic environment, you are obviously talking about the kind of economy that particular society has. So, that means you will be talking about the level of development, you will be talking about the kind of houses that you have, you will be talking about the kind of manufacturing that takes place, right. You will also be talking about the manner in which we exchange, you will talk about the manner in which there is a distribution of goods and also the consumption of wealth, right. Now, when you talk about the cultural and the social environment, as students of sociology and society, you already know that the cultural and the social environment will include all ways of life, right. So, that means it will include your customs, it will include your traditions, it will include religion, it will include laws, it will in short include the way that you think, it will include the way that you interact with one another, right. So, and please also remember, when you are talking about the cultural and the social environment, it is also linked to the economic environment, the physical and the biological environment, right, and which in turn will be linked to the level of development of each society, right. Now, broadly speaking, as sociologists, in terms of development, we classify societies into hunting and gathering societies, into pastoral societies, agricultural and industrial societies. Now, you could very well ask that why are we talking about the different kinds of societies if we are talking about the economy and the environment, right, or sorry, if you are talking about the society and the environment. Now, the reason why we talk about this is because in the very beginning, I did tell you that the interaction of man with the environment is also influenced by the level of development, economic development of that particular society, right? So, for example, if you're talking about a hunting and a gathering society, you're obviously talking about a society which is at a lower level of development. You're talking about a society which is basically based on hunting of animals and gathering of wild fruits and vegetables. So, obviously, you'll also be talking about a society in which there is a very simple division of labor based on age and sex, and it's a subsistence economy, right? Now, when you talk about a pastoral economy, on the other hand, a pastoral economy is slightly more developed than the hunting and a gathering economy, because in a hunting and a gathering economy, you're obviously not settled. Now, in a pastoral economy, on the other hand, you are now beginning to talk about domestication of animals, right? You're talking about an economy in which there is also some form of agriculture which might be developing, but the kind of agriculture that one is talking about is again, more of a shifting kind of an agriculture. So, a pastoral economy, you're talking about domestication of plants, you're talking about domestication of animals as well, right? Now, when you talk about an agricultural economy, on the other hand, you're talking about a more settled way of life. You're talking about a level of economic development in which people are more settled. And please remember, we began by talking about the physical, the economic, and the social and cultural environment, right? So, in these kind of societies, what you see is that in an agricultural economy, people are more settled. They may start having permanent houses. You will also find that there is also the production of a surplus, right? Hunting and a gathering, I said, was a subsistence economy. A pastoral economy is one level up than a hunting and a gathering economy, but nevertheless, surplus that is being produced is not too much. In an agricultural economy, on the other hand, you're talking about a more settled way of life, and of course, domestication of animals is also there, and you might also find the beginnings of some form of a exchange, the kind that you are familiar with in the kind of societies that you live in, right? Now, at the highest level of development, you will have an industrial economy. And in an industrial economy, you're obviously talking about an economy in which there is machine-based production, and there is by and large people living in the urban areas, right? And as the photographs show you, you're also looking at how is it that there is a higher level of pollution, because you're using more and more technology. And in an industrial economy, it does not mean that agriculture stops. Of course not. Instead, what might happen is that agriculture also becomes industrialized. I'm sure you have heard of cash crops, you've heard of mechanization of agriculture, you've heard of the green revolution, right? So, you're talking about an economy in which there is the onset of machine-based production for agriculture as well as for goods and services. As far as the impact of development of societies is concerned, now you see, when I'm talking about the impact of development of societies, I'm talking about the impact of development of societies in terms of, pollution, for example. The photograph shows you, this is a photograph of Delhi, which shows you how very polluted the air is. So, you're talking about the impact of development in terms of air pollution, in terms of water pollution, in terms of mountain pollution. This photograph actually shows the Mount Everest littered with all kinds of debris. You are also talking about pollution which is occurring because of the kind of plastic that is being generated. So, that means what we are talking about is how is it that the level of development of a particular society, you began with a hunting and a gathering society and you moved on to a pastoral, agricultural, and then an industrial society. And what you have seen is that as the level of, as societies develop economically, right, economic development is also something, please remember, which is also linked to your way of life. It is also linked to the other aspects of your life. That means economic development cannot be looked at independent of your social and cultural development, right? So, when you are talking about pollution, you are obviously talking about the use of, you're also talking about how is it that your way of life is now being influenced by your level of development, which in turn is influencing the environment, right? So, that means you are now talking about how is it that of life has an impact on the environment that you live in. And we began by saying that the environment is something which surrounds us completely. And we said it includes your physical aspects as well as your social and cultural aspects. And these photographs show you that what has been the impact of development, right? Now, when one talks about this kind of impact of development, the world as a whole started talking about sustainable development. The question that next arises is that what do you mean by sustainability, right? Now, when you talk about sustainability, basically what you are saying here is that you have to recognize that the way of life which human beings follow, the way of life which man follows, has to be one in which you are able to sustain your level of development without harming the environment, right? That means you begin to recognize that the economy exists within a particular environment, and you have to recognize that the economy, society and environment are all a part of your development, and you have to make sure that all three of these aspects are in sync with one another. Now, when I say that all parts of these the economy, society and environment have to be in sync with one another, what does it mean? What it simply means is that, for example, if you're talking about economic development, you're talking about using a kind of a technology, right? So what it would imply is that you as members of society begin to use a kind of technology which does not harm your environment. So, for example, say for instance, you could talk about using fuels which are not fossil fuels. For example, you could talk about using compressed natural gas. You could talk about using wind energy, right? You could talk about about harnessing, let's say, the solar energy. So those are ways in which there is sustainability, right? Now, sustainability of an environment, sustainability in terms of economic development is only possible if one ensures that there is an equitable level of development across board. Now, when I say equitable level of development across board, what does this mean? What it simply means is that you have to take care that that there is for example, an even distribution of population. Now, how does that impact us? Okay, look at it this way. You are talking about an increase in human population. An increase in human population would mean that there is going to be an overexploitation of resources that you need, overexploitation of fuel, overexploitation of fodder, overexploitation of shelter. For example, one of the reasons that is often given is that why is there so much pollution in Delhi? The argument that is often put forth is that it is so very polluted because of the fact that there are an increasing number of cars on Delhi's roads, right? Now, when you say there is an increasing number of cars on Delhi's roads, it obviously means that there is a high density of population. Now, why is there a high density of population? There is a high density of population in Delhi, for instance. Why? Because what's happening is Delhi is a place where there is a lot of economic opportunities available to people. If there is a lot of economic opportunities available to people in Delhi, that means that areas which surround Delhi do not have as many economic opportunities. Therefore, people will migrate from surrounding areas to Delhi in order to ensure that they are able to maintain a reasonable level of development, in order to ensure that they are able to earn their livelihoods. And all of that is going to put a strain on your environment, right? So, keeping this in mind, you have to understand that sustainability is something which is because of overexploitation in terms of fishing, agriculture, overuse of fresh water, deforestation, you're talking about industrialization, right? You're also talking about soil degradation, you're talking about climate change, you're talking about the impact on the health of people, you're also talking about poverty and income inequality as well. So that means in order to attain a sustainable level of development, it is extremely important for the government to have certain institutional mechanisms in place, right? Now, when you talk about an institutional mechanism, what does that mean? An institutional mechanism means that the government should have certain laws in place, it should have certain regulations in place, certain norms in place, in which it ensures that there is, for instance, an equal level of development in the rural areas, in the urban areas, as well as in terms of the industry. A short while ago, I just gave you an example of how is it that people are migrating to Delhi. Now, why is it that people are migrating to Delhi? People are migrating to Delhi because of an inequitable level of development, say for example, in the rural areas. So, for instance, if there is going to be, the surrounding urban areas are not so very well developed, it is but natural that people will migrate to Delhi, right? And when I'm talking about not well developed, I don't just simply mean in terms of livelihood. I also mean it in terms of, infrastructure development. I also mean it in terms of, health. I also mean it in terms of schools that are available. I also mean it in terms of social security. So that means when you are talking about an equitable level of development in terms of sustainability, that means you have to ensure that people, people all around, people in your country, people in the world as a whole, for instance, are healthy. You have to ensure that there is employment for them. You have to ensure that as far as the vulnerable sections of population are concerned, they have social security. There are educational facilities that are available to all sections of society. So that means when you are talking about, and all of this is going to have an impact on your environment, right? Now, it is going to have an impact on land, it is going to have an impact on water, energy, in terms of environmental awareness, and also in terms of, science and technology. Now, you see, so that means what are we saying? What we are basically saying is by ensuring a certain level of economic development, you are going to ensure a certain way of life, which means a certain level of social development, social and cultural development, which in turn is going to have an impact on your environment. And when I talk about the environment, I am talking about the physical environment, which includes your land and water. I am also talking about the biological environment, which means, the plants, the animals, the birds that surround us. I am also talking about the kind of science and technology that you are using. So that means when the world as a whole started talking about sustainable development, they started saying that what we need to do is we need to ensure that there is a certain level of sustainable development. And as a first step towards that, we started talking about this as early as 1945, and this is 2019, right? So many years back we started talking about it for the first time. 19 this amazing thing called the Club of Rome, where for the first time they started talking about, look, we need to look after our environment in the world as a whole. And the Club of Rome 1968, if I remember correctly, finally led to the Stockholm Conference, which happened in 1972. And in the Stockholm Conference, one basically started talking about, the world as a whole got together and the United Nations saying that what we need to do is we need to chart out an action plan in which we are going to look after our environment, we are going to assess the damage that we have done to our environment, and we will start seeing how is it that we can look after our environment, right? Now, the Stockholm Conference was not just the only thing that happened. After the Stockholm Conference, you also had something called the Brundtland Commission report. Now, this came in 1983, and as the photograph shows you, you start talking about our common future. And in the Commission, you started saying that, look, what we need to do is we have to ensure that just because we're talking about sustainability, just because we're talking about protecting our environment, does not mean that we start compromising on the kind of technology that we use. You see, because the basic argument that one gives is, all right, if the kind of technology that we are using, if industrialization, for instance, the kind of technology that we are using in our industries, if that is bad for the environment, then let's stop talking about industrialization. But no, that is not the answer. Instead, you need to come up with alternatives, right? So the Brundtland Commission report is saying that, look, we cannot talk about compromise the quality of our lives, right? We have to make sure that we maintain a certain level of development and we are able to sustain the needs of generation as well. So that means now we started talking about needs. We started talking about not just the need of this generation, but also the needs of the future generations, that let us have enough for our future generations. Now, this was again then followed up by the Rio Summit in 1992, where where the same kind of a discussion was carried forward, and you started saying that there has to be an equal concentration of the environment, concentration in terms of development of the environment, society and economy. We also have to ensure that we are able to look after the needs of our future generations. So they came up with something called the Agenda 21. That means this is how we are going to maintain a sustainable level of development in the 21st century, right? And there was a global consensus, there was a political commitment, and you also started involving the non-governmental organizations, that is the NGOs, and you started figuring out how is it that we are going to be ensuring that we look after our environment while ensuring a certain level of development. Now, this shows you a certain kind of a timeline of the various conferences that have been held at different points of time. And if you take in 2000, for instance, you had one of the largest ever gatherings in the world, and you started saying, all right, we are now going to set targets for ourselves. Now, these were called the MDGs. I'm sure you've heard of the MDGs, which actually means the Millennium Development Goals. And you started saying that we are going to be talking about, we are going to be talking about looking after. So, you had something like, 8 goals. You said we will eradicate hunger, we will look after education, we will look after maternal mortality rates, we will make sure that our population has enough drinking water, we will start using more environmental friendly technology, and our goal has to be a global partnership for all. Now, an offshoot of all of this is that please remember that India also is a part of the United Nations. So, all that we are talking about in the context of the United Nations also had an impact on India, right. So, for example, India started working towards universal education. I am sure you have heard of the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, right. I am sure you have heard of the national health missions. Now, what are all of these? These are all in response to the goals and targets which were set by the United Nations. I am sure you have also heard of the National Rural Employment Generation schemes, right. So, you have the NREGA schemes. All of those are, attempts of the government to ensure equitable development, ensure that we are able to develop in a sustainable way without damaging the environment. And in fact, in terms of the MDGs, what you have is that we are supposed to achieve the targets by 2015, but one of the targets that we managed to achieve by 2009 was that we were able to ensure that at least the target that we had for providing safe drinking water. By 2009, the number of people who did not have access to safe drinking water was reduced by half, right. Now, a review of these was done, and then the world as a whole through the United Nations came up with something called the Sustainable Development Goals, which replaced the MDGs, and we came up with the SDGs, as they are called, in 2016. Now, the SDGs have something like 17 goals, and they're carrying forward the agenda of the MDGs, right. You're still talking about poverty eradication, you're talking about hunger reduction, you're talking about gender equality, you're talking about protecting the water, talking about protecting the air, etc., etc. In short, you are talking about ensuring that our environment is safe, right. So, that means, dear listeners, what we have been talking about today is that how is it that there is a very complex relationship between man and nature. How is it that when we talk about man, we are not just talking about men as biological beings. Instead, we are talking about men in terms of how they exist in this on this earth. We are talking about a certain level of economic development, physical development, and social development. So, that means, in short, we are talking about sustainable development. So, today when we talk about the environment and society, we are talking about a sustainable level of development. We are talking about developing without harming the environment. We are talking about ensuring that the needs of all individuals are met, and we are also able to protect and preserve our environment for the future generations. Thank you.